Hi everybody, my name is AK Rex. I am back with my friend and also my server moderator, Jason, who is also, in case you are new to the channel, he is a paleontologist. And we have already done the first segment of this particular video, which is just basically discussing Reptilia as a big, massive clade or group, you could probably call it. And we have also done numerous other videos together with other members of my community and with Jason exclusively. If you would like to check them out, please go either into the description box or feel free to browse the channel and to get up to date. Now that we are here, Jason, shall we continue our discussion of the Reptilia group and from where we left off? So last time we covered Lepidosauria and Testudine, and now where are we off to? Would you like to take over and give us the guide?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Yes, so last time we covered, as you mentioned, Lepidosauria and Testudine. So basically we covered the turtles and lizards and snakes, and it was sort of a broad survey of the groups as a whole, mostly focused on the modern day animals, so the extant animals, and then a little bit of a foray into some neat extinct critters. So today we wanted to round us out and talk about the last group of reptiles that are alive today. In this instance, we're going to go with the monophyletic reptilia, so the Sauropsida, because the last group we're looking at is Archosauria, which is made up of our crocodilians and our birds. So we're going to cover both of those guys today. And I was trying to see if I had a thing handy ahead of time.
So this image right here that we have, it's a very general image, obviously, so it also shows us, although it does tell us obviously that Ornithodira and Pseudotsuchia. Pseudotsuchia obviously means they're, if we take into account extinct, there's going to be a lot of members there. Ornithodira, for obvious reasons, since we do a lot of dinosaurs and pterosaurs here, that's going to be part of Ornithodira. And but in terms of the members that are alive today, when it comes to Pseudotsuchians, we are talking about all of the crocodiles and alligators of today, and Gerials,
Right.
and all of the ornithodirans that are alive today are basically birds, and I guess that's it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's funky for me. Yeah, it's strange that, or not strange, but it's interesting that we have these two major groups we're looking at today, and they're both comprised of critters that they're both comprised of animals that come from a lineage that was really super diverse in the past and did a whole bunch of different stuff. And the modern animals are still diverse, but they're definitely much more specialized in their own area. It's actually it's a bit of a, I guess you could say, running joke in paleontology with archosaurs, is that we had all these different archosaurs in the past, and then of the two that are around today, one of them took control of the sky and the other took control of the water. So they're both like in opposite directions of each other.
Right. So what would you like to start with? Let's say if we go to Pseudotsuchia, or did
Right.
you want to start with ornithodirans first?
Well, so I wanted to, just sort of give us a broad mention. So the image on the screen is showing what we talked about before and then where we're going. And it is showing off some of the animals that we've talked about in the past, sort of in a generic sense. The Colonia or Testudine bits, I have them outside of Diapsida in this image, which is an older interpretation of where turtles were or came from. There are multiple interpretations that stick them inside Diapsida. Some of them are sister groups to Lepidosaurs, others are sister groups to our, not even sister groups to our Archosaurs, but a type of Archosaur. So that part I'll say is still in flux. This is just an interpretation that is available for where turtles go, but understand that, yeah, they could be kind of flipping all around the tree at the moment. But that just shows sort of all the other guys we've already talked about, and so now we're gonna focus down on those Archosaurs. And so yeah, we would start with our probably down with our Pseudotsuchians. So sort of keep it in the sort of classic reptiles a bit first. So as Archosaurs, we do think of Archosaurs for their some unique features, right? So they stand out from the other reptiles for different structures. The biggest one that people are probably familiar with is that antorbital fenestra. So that sort of window between the eye and the nose that in large theropods can often be confused with an eye. And so this is a large area of the skull that housed a enlarged paranasal sinus, so a sort of a dead-end airspace that branches off of the nasal passages. It got really big in theropods, and it got really big in pterosaurs. But in our modern animals, so in modern crocodilians and birds, it's either gotten a lot smaller or it's gotten smaller and roofed over.
Right.
One of the things I wanted to make a quick.
So right now we're talking sort of just the anatomy, both the phenotype and what we can find inside based on at least extant examples, which is what we're mainly going to focus on today. Just to see what it is that basically a person who is into the reptilia should be aware of if they want to understand the differences between what sets Archosaurs apart from, say, Lepidosaurs and Testudines, aside from some of the obvious things, you know.
Yes, I mean, like, 'cause there are, each one of them has a bunch of different, each group has their own sort of set of unique characters or synapomorphia, so shared evolved characters. And a lot of it is it would be us delving into the weeds to see like what unique feature is for which. But with Archosaurs, that antorbital fenestra is nice just because it is very prominent in like common, what's the word I'm looking for, like popular culture. Like you see it popping up in like National Geographic episodes or documentaries on dinosaurs all the time.
Right.
Because it's just such a large structure.
So to be sure, just so I understand, obviously in this case, if I were to look at just your average, well, I don't even know if there is a very good term to describe, because I was going to say average theropod, but let's just stick with average theropod for the simplicity's sake, so don't scold me for it in the comments, please. Be nice. So, when you look at where the eye placement is, that's obviously that area there is a fenestra that you're referring to in terms of to understand the scientific terminology, or you're talking about the one that is directly in front of it, where the crests basically that go just prior to the brows, or are we talking about the one that I formerly mentioned? Which one? Maybe it's a good idea to find perhaps a diagram of sort that
Yeah,
shows something of some kind, or just any picture of a skull that could be a good pointer, so that we can get the terminal. Because remember that a lot of my audience might not be very, even I myself am not very technical when it comes to operating the terms, and I've always said that, so there's nothing new about it. And I let's just say I try to connect the parts that somebody as knowledgeable as you are in technical aspects can deliver, and then translate it, let's just say, into the more common English for the people who don't wield these terms very well. Does it make sense?
Yep, I gotcha. So I'm going to send this image, should help out. There's 1,000 things always need to be saved over and over. Okay, so Here, I'm going to bring on an image of just everyone's favorite theropod. Oh, files are too powerful. A second, I got to drop the size of this thing.
That's okay. So while we are going to quickly open this image up to
Okay, so here is a image of, like I said, everyone's
hold on a
favorite
second.
dinosaur.
I'm still trying to open up. Oh, there's a T-Rex as well. Okay. So I'll save this as well.
Look at T-Rex, and we're going to go ahead and jump into the past for a bit.
Okay,
so,
yeah, so it's going to be only for the demonstrative purposes, so we're not going to actually go too deep into dinosaurs just yet, so that's going to happen. It's just not going to happen right away, right here, if you will. So, and...
yes, so in our Tyrannosaurus skull,
give me a second to quickly capture it, because
yep, certainly.
OBS is just being done.
A little bit slow, I get that.
There we go. So we got a Tyrannosaurus finally. Sorry about the delay, guys. We're obviously just doing it as we go. We'd like to basically do it live, if you will, since I don't really have, because of work, I don't have a lot of time to edit videos anymore, so I'm just gonna do it this way for now. So apologies. Sorry, Jason, continue, please.
Yeah, sorry. Ooh, that's not that. Okay, so we have our picture of Tyrannosaurus here, and it's showing two things. It has two arrows pointing at it, right? So the red arrow is pointing to that antorbital fenestra, which is that really large window that you're seeing in the skull. And then that green, or lightish green, is pointing to where the eyeball is, right? So the eye is way back over there, and then on the other end you can see where the nose is, where the nostril should be. But that really big area, the biggest hole that you really see in the skull is that antorbital fenestra, which is just this giant area that was holding a paranasal air sinus in place. And there's actually a little bit of a hole in front of that as well, like your promaxillary fenestra. That's all just one structure that you're looking at. So the way that antorbital fenestra is put together, the sinus has eaten away a lot of that bone, but kept some of it intact.
Right.
But it's all just one giant sinus with a bunch of diverticula, or not a bunch, but large diverticula kind of popping through and just keeping some bone and eating away the rest of the bone. So that's your sort of your classic dinosaur look. Because we love theropods and T-Rex in particular, it became like the real poster child for what a dinosaur skull should look like, and so it really highlights that antorbital fenestra very well.
Okay.
In contrast to that, if we go to the bird picture...
So if I were to exchange this picture right now to this one right here that I have in front of us, and you got a red arrow pointing into that little hole, if I will borrow the word from you.
Yes, so in this image we're looking at, God, what was it? I think I grabbed a pigeon skull. Don't hold me to that one. But yeah, so in this image, it's from Bone Clones. We're looking at a bird skull. You can see a very large hole in the front by the brain case, where the eyeball would go. And then you see another large hole way up by the beak, and that's where the nostrils would be coming in. And then you have this other little hole in between it, and that's the antorbital fenestra in a bird. And
right.
Bird antorbital fenestra, all in all, don't get very large. They're pretty small compared to the rest of the structures inside the skull. So much more reduced in birds compared to a lot of archosaurs in the past. And I was going to pull up an image for crocodiles to show where their antorbital fenestra is, but the catch with that one is that crocodiles don't have an antorbital fenestra anymore. So they actually walled over the area where the sinus is, or I guess you could say the sinus didn't eat away enough bone to uncover that spot anymore. So they still have the sinus, and it's in the same spot that we're seeing in the bird and in the dinosaur. It's just covered by bone on the outside, so we can't see it. Right. But they all have it, and that's what makes them archosaurs, or one of the big things that makes them archosaurs.
So it has obviously, so it starts all from the head, basically.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of reptile phylogenetics, a lot of animal vertebrate phylogenetics relies heavily on the head. A lot of things happen in the head. It is where we showcase or we centralize a lot of our senses. And then that's where the big switch box, the brain, hangs out. So between that and the fact that you have to eat using your head, there's a lot of interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Compromises being made between these competing parts of the skull and how the head has to adapt to it. So it makes heads very distinguished and useful for systematics.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, to continue into this, do you have any more comments about the specific distinguishments with the skull structure of the Archosaurs that tells them apart, let's say, from Lepidosaurs and the other, like turtles and stuff? Or do
That's the big one.
That's the big one, okay. So what are the other ones then?
The other structures relate to how the ankle joint is put together, and that's where it gets a little more separate or less defined, because different Archosaurs have different ways they put their ankle joints together.
Oh yes, we definitely know
Archosaurs
that.
in general tended towards erect stance, so walking with their hind legs underneath their body.
Right.
Early Archosaurs, and Archosauria itself is old, which is the thing I meant to mention. So we're looking at about a middle Triassic origin for Archosauria, so say around 247 million years ago. And they all came out as fairly small animals in the beginning. So what you consider like a standard lizard size, maybe like a large iguana size.
So they didn't go as far as 250 yet, have they? Or past 250, so 247 is
I
just
mean, they're
around.
close to it, but
Close
I
to it,
mean,
right?
yeah, it's. I don't know if they've really crossed that threshold yet. I wouldn't be surprised as we keep finding these specimens if that number gets pulled back a little bit. It's doubtful Archosauria ever happened outside of the Triassic period, like before it. So there was probably not a Permian Archosaur, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get into early Triassic as some origins, because that tends to be how these things go. You find the initial specimen, and then as you find more specimens, you start ratcheting things backward.
So in other words, there is still, like, if we were to stretch it, we could say early Triassic, but if we were to be rather, at the moment at least, based on the current evidence, to be a bit more unrealistic, then some people could say Permian, but if that were to happen, what would that mean if it were to happen? Let's just say if we discover an Archosaur in the Permian period somewhere, like late Permian, for example, what would that actually mean?
It would be a big jump, and so it would require some folks to. It would require the discoverers to really justify the claim. So make sure that the specimen wasn't reworked during fossilization or after fossilization. That the bedding that it came from was accurately dated, that kind of stuff. So again, it's unlikely that they had a Permian origin, for what that's worth.
Sure.
But yeah, if they wind up in early Triassic, no one would be that surprised.
Right. Okay. So with that in mind, let's continue.
Yes. So anyway, yeah. So old group. One of the distinguishing features, that big antorbital fenestra. The group as a whole tended towards walking upright with their legs underneath their body. This is really reserved for the hind legs. There's a lot of talk about whether some critters walked the erect stance or not, and then the forelimbs are almost always taken out of the equation. So this is really just reserved for the hips themselves. But yeah, so all early Archosaurs showed signs of this move towards this erect stance, and by the time we get into Pseudotsuchia and into Ornithodira, we're looking at animals that already were walking pretty much with their legs, their hind legs underneath their body. So it's a way they stand out from a lot of the other reptiles of the time. So they were running around doing that. Why they were doing it is an area that remains unknown. So it's an area of interest, because why would you go this route? What do you gain from it?
I
The
have a
original
question
idea.
about this, by the way, that I
Yeah.
just came up with. I was curious when we talk about obviously the extant Archosaurs, basic crocodilians of any kind that are alive today. Would you be able to potentially verify this information and uh, say that when the crocodilians or alligators, when they walk on land, do they actually maintain this consistency that you have just referred to prior to this, as in, walk the upright, specifically with the hind legs? Or would they still spread them around, slightly outwards? Or am I misunderstanding it completely? How would you
It
explain this?
Yeah, and it's an area we'll delve into when we get into Crocodilia, which is
Gotcha.
the corner. It is dependent. It is the crocodilians today have unique range to their stance because they can have a very sprawling stance where their legs are hanging out on their side and they only lift their bodies up a little bit as they kind of scuttle along the ground. And then they have the ability to tuck their legs pretty much right underneath their body and walk around. This is in Crocs called a high walk, as a means of distinguishing it from the erect stances of mammals and birds. It's largely a made-up term when you think about it, because the high walk of an alligator is more erect than the typical walk of a squirrel or even a mouse. So it's not really anything distinct that would separate it that badly. And then depending on the species and even the individual, those legs can go from pretty far away from the midline, so pretty semi-erect, to being completely under the midline, just like a typical mammal. So they have the ability to do that. Some species do it more often than others, and then some individuals do it more often than others. There is a study by Steve Gatesy way back in the 90s. Where did I have it, actually? I made a note of that. Yeah, back in the 90s, where he was studying alligators walking on treadmills and just studying how they move their hind legs. And he had one specimen that basically, for all intents and purposes, would have been classified as as erect, stanced as a mammal, and it just happened to walk with its legs tucked under its body the whole time. It was just one random little alligator that decided to do that.
Mhm.
So a lot of variation in there.
It could also
Um,
maybe have something to do with their ability to, maintain their balance and just the height and the posture, depending on their mass as well. Because some alligators, as we see, when they are still young, especially, and the female members of them, they don't tend to go very high in mass. And once they get to a certain age, and obviously when the disparities become more apparent, like the older males, they're pretty damn big for your
they
average
are.
alligators, and that could explain why sometimes they might not quite walk the same way. It's my just kind of guessing, by the way. I'm not making a claim, but I'm actually curious if these things could potentially be attributed to that as well. And the same for crocodiles in general too.
Yeah, there is some size-related shifting in posture as animals grow up and get larger. Um, yeah, I mean, those are the two big things I want to talk about with Archosauria. Is just that they're unique for the way they hold their legs under their body, and then they have that big antorbital fenestra. So, as we saw in in the very first image, the way it's split up. If we really look at how reptiles are split, you can see that there's that major group. There's a sort of that major basal split between the Lepidosauria group and then the Archosaurs. And then that's where we're really getting this big radiation in all the different species. There are animals in between that were doing their own stuff. And we'll talk about that in a future follow-up video because they're all extinct. But at least amongst...
Can I just say something as well? And I think
Yeah.
you could probably make some points. At least I suspect there are some points to be made about it. That um, when we look at the tree like this, we are not trying to give the impression that we are under the assumption that every single other animal that might not quite fit in either of the groups would necessarily be attributed to them for the purpose of the discussion. As in, we are aware that there are some basal potential members in certain of the groups that don't fit neither here nor there. Although, as you said, they are extinct, so technically they wouldn't be a problem, if you will, for us here in this video, since we are discussing the extant primarily. And we're only using extinct as references to highlight certain points about, the extant as well. But yeah, I just wanted the viewers to be aware of that, and that's it when it comes. This is just another thing about phylogenetics, by the way. It's not all black and white as this picture here shows it.
Literally black and white. Yes.
Well, yeah, I tried. I was trying my best here. I was really trying. Anyway, sorry, Jason. Carry on.
Yeah, right. Because a real, if we had the true tree, the sort of fantastical, impossible to get at true tree, it would be uncountable amounts of different branches going off, and either many of them dying out, and then some making their way to where we are today. So we're doing these kind of trees where this one is very simplified. We're really just culling it down to everyone who's alive today, and we're using very broad strokes for what makes what counts as that group, right? So there's representatives on there that are just some random animal in that group that happens to represent an animal in that group. But we're definitely downplaying the level of detail and diversity that you would expect from all these animals, just because it makes sense in this context.
Fair enough. So
yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So I see. And what about? Oh my God! I had a question for you, but I forgot. Okay, sorry. Let's just let you carry on, and if it comes up again, then I will bring it back in.
Come back to it.
Yeah, I'll come back to it if it comes up. Yeah, must not have been too important then if I forgot so easily.
Not a problem. So we have our two big split. We have Lepidosaurs. We have Lepidosaur Morpha group that leads to our lizards and snakes, and then we have the Archosaurs. And so today we're focusing on the Archosaurs. Among Archosaurs, there's also two big splits, right? So another big split at the base, and this is really, if you just do this with each group, you find that there's always some kind of big split somewhere, usually by the base. So in this case, for Archosaurs, our big split is into the Pseudotsuchians and into the Ornithodyrans. So we'll start on the Pseudotsuchian side at the moment. So that's the group that's going to give us our crocodiles.
Right.
And then there is the irony of it. Pseudotsuchia was originally coined as a term for all of these fecodonts, in big air quotes. So early archosaurs that looked kind of like dinosaurs, kind of like crocodiles. And when you tallied up all the same structures, they wound up coming out closer to crocodiles, but they didn't really look like crocodiles. So they were called the Pseudotsuchians, or the false crocodiles.
Right.
Then as we learn more about the different groups and we started incorporating phylogenetics into our systematics, or we used cladistics to sort of quantify our systematics, then we found out that the true crocodiles, or the Eusuchians, wound up being members of the Pseudotsuchians. So now the true crocodiles are members of the false crocodiles, because names mean nothing, apparently.
Mm.
So we don't change it because of stability. There was a time when we used to call them the Croatarsons, but then Sterling Nesbitt in a landmark paper in, I want to say 2000 and, I have to look it up again. Maybe 2007. I'll double check it. Found out that the anchoring point for Croatarsi was on these critters called phytosaurs, which look a lot like alligators and crocodiles, but turned out not to be all that closely related to them, or really any more closely related to crocodiles than they are to birds. So because of that anchoring point, it wound up dragging the definition of Croatarsi all the way down, that it basically includes almost all archosaurs. So kind of became a useless term, which is why you don't see it used as much anymore.
I see, yeah.
But that means that we're stuck with Pseudotsuchia. which is how the false crocodiles wound up giving rise to the true crocodiles. So, speaking of, so we're all aware of the concept of crocodilia, crocodilians in general. Well, especially on this channel, are well aware of what they're like. We have examples in our heads, often like of American alligators or Nile crocodiles or saltwater crocodiles. The lineage itself is very old, right? So we're talking about Pseudotsuchia right here. So we're talking about animals that were coming around the mid-Triassic time. So again, right, it makes sense. Origin of Archosauria, origin of Pseudotsuchia. They're basically almost at the same time period because this was such a basal split into different groups. But crocodilians themselves, the group that we would call modern-day crocodiles, they don't start until we get Eusuchia, so the true crocodiles, and that doesn't start until somewhere around the mid-early Cretaceous period. So we're talking closer to maybe 110, 90 million years, somewhere around there, when we start getting the first true crocodiles. So they come in a lot later.
Right. So, when did the split between the Eusuchia and Pseudotsuchia actually occur, if you have a rough number of estimate in terms of the million years ago?
Yeah, probably somewhere around that, like 110 million years ago or so.
Right.
So it wound up being an offshoot that came out. There's a whole bunch of different splits that happened along the way, right? So as our Pseudotsuchians started breaking up and we started moving away from these Rausuchians, which you can talk about another time, the Postasuchians, and then we're into this group called Crocodile Morpha, and that gives us Phoenosuchians and the Meso-U crocodiles, which is a whole thing, Telatasuchians. Everything ends in Suchian with croc because it just means croc. But yeah, I'd say about mid-early Cretaceous is around when we start getting the first Eusuchians. So the first animal that we could look at and say with a fair bit of confidence that we can nail this thing down to some member of a modern-day crocodile, right? So it's a crocodilid, or it's an alligatorid, or it's a gavialoid. So those are the three big groups that we have today: is the alligators, the crocodiles, the gavials, or Gerials.
Right.
On the alligator side, so the whole group itself alive today is about 27 species alive today. That number will probably climb into the 30s in the next few years because there's a lot of more detailed looks at different species of modern day crocs and realizing that a lot of things that were originally thought to be one animal or one species are actually 2 or 3 or 4 different species.
Right.
So that is ongoing work. But still, 27, 30, it's not a very large assortment of animals today, species-wise, as they were in the past, even in the recent past. So they have gone down a bit in diversity, but this is a thing that this group is known to do. So there's a bit of this kind of ebb and flow in Pseudotsuchians where they expand out to do a whole bunch of different things, and then extinction comes down and it really creates a bottleneck, and they expand out to do it again, and extinction, and so on. It's nothing new for them.
Right, I see what you mean. Okay.
So yeah, so if we split up into the groups, you have your crocodilids. So they're the animals that we would call the real crocodiles, where you get the names crocodile. And they're the most speciose today. They also have the largest distribution, so you find them in most places around the world, usually in the tropical to slightly subtropical time regions. Then you have the alligatorids, and that includes your alligators and your caiman, or caimans. So there's 2 species of alligators alive today. Both of those live in very temperate areas, so we have them in the southern United States, and then also you can find them in the southeast of China, a small group. And then we have the gavialoid or gavialids, or the Gerials, and there's really just one species for that, which is Gavialis gangeticus, and that is found in India. They are a very specialized group of crocodilian, and they are also highly endangered because they are so specialized and they don't cover a very large range. And there's a controversy in the group because with systematics and reptiles, there always seems to be controversy. And that's around a group of crocodilian called the false Gerials.
Right, right.
They might be a type of Gerial that just looks different enough to be separate, or they might be a crocodile or crocodilid that is doing its best to look like a gavial. Yeah. So traditionally it was the latter, but with molecular systematics coming on the fore and becoming more and more popular, there's been a stronger push to put false Gerials in with the true Gerials, and so there's a lot of bloody battles fought over that one.
So let me get this straight. So basically both animals are alive and they exist today, but they're still struggling to understand how they actually fit this whole system and relate to one another.
Yeah, there's just a... Oh, that's actually a good image. There is a lot of confusion because they look very similar, but they also don't. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, kind of.
So if you look at just the morphology.
It's like it kind of does. It kind of doesn't. Same way as you framed it before. But there is a reason behind the question, though. It's just kind of wanted to get people to really think about this. If we are having, to put it bluntly, issues getting this resolved to whatever satisfactory conclusion, at least at present time, how much do you think we can rely on possibly resolving these kind of issues when we're talking about extinct species? I want people to think about this for a second as well when they're watching and listening. Especially when it comes to dinosaurs, especially with dinosaurs and pterosaurs and things like that, when you start getting into the species that just have no living equivalents present in modern day life.
I think, so with modern animals, like our issue with the false Gerials and the true Gerials, we have access to the whole animal, so we can do a lot of studies on the DNA of the animals. We can look at soft tissue structures
without hurting the animal either, by the way, just so I can put this out there.
Ideally. Sometimes there are things that are done where it does hurt the animal, and I'm less of a fan of those.
Yeah.
But yes, there's a lot of stuff
But if the animal has, let's just say if the animal passed away from natural causes, that would potentially make a case study subject of some sort?
Yes, and in fact, I've done work on animals that have passed away, and I think that's fine because the animal's gone, and there's not anything like aside from just like burial. There's really nothing we can do for them anymore. But when we at least do dissections or CT scans, or we take genomic data from it, then there's a potential for that animal to live on in science as data to actually help us learn more about those animals. So that is a plus.
All right.
So
let's continue.
Yeah, so we have access to all of these things, right? So
great. Yeah.
We have access to the whole animal when you do that. We still have a lot of argument over where they belong, who's closely related to what, so on. When we bring that down to dinosaurs or a lot of other extinct animals where all we have are the fossils, then you're really just relying on skeletal material, rarely some soft tissue that might be preserved, and then interpretations of behavior based on taphonomy as your guide. So we have a much smaller assortment, a much smaller collection of data to work with, a lot harder to nail down who belongs where.
I see. So, since we are obviously approaching our 40 minutes literally right now, so that's kind of almost 20 minutes away from the first hour. Is there any other area you would like to bring up and explore and explain to my viewers? Well, our viewers technically, because you're a member of the community, but you know what I mean. For the viewers in terms of the Sudasukians or just Crocodilians in general, before we potentially dedicate maybe the second half to birds.
Yeah, I mean, we've really just we've barely touched on anything.
Oh, have we? Okay, let's go then. Let's see what else.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to do that and then also give you access to comparison images.
Right.
So this is just showing so the image I just sent is just for people wanting to get a visual we're looking at. So you have your Tomistoma false Gerial on top, and you have your Gavialis or
Right.
your true
So
Gerial on the bottom.
give me a couple more seconds, please, to bring the image up. So it doesn't. It takes me a few moments to do that.
Certainly.
It's
So
right here. Okay.
Morphologically, one of them, the top one, is typically associated with Crocodilia and Crocodilids. So it's some kind of crocodilid that wound up looking like a Gerial. And then under molecular data, they wind up coming out as sister groups to each other. So then they just wind up being almost like a type of Gerial. So it's confusing. We use the fossils to help reduce some of that confusion. So far, it hasn't. But, we can hope.
I see.
But those are these guys there. So just to help toss in some ideas for folks. So I'll try to run through this a little bit faster.
Don't rush yourself too much. Just kind of do it at your own comfort.
But yes, so distinguishing characteristics of crocodilians in general are that they're large. Right? There's not really a small crocodile today. I mean, there are small crocodilians, but they don't really get small. The smallest is a group of dwarf caiman called Paleozookas, in particular Paleozookas palpebrosus, which is the smallest one. That's Schneider's dwarf caiman.
Right.
Or sorry, that's Cuvier's dwarf caiman. And that grows to between 1.2, 1.6 meters in length and between, like, say, 12 to 20 kilograms in weight. So that is the smallest crocodile alive today. And that is already larger than most lizards and snakes today, and larger than most birds today. Honestly, even larger than most mammals.
And that's
As a
actually a
general
good point. Yeah.
weird thing. But so, just an idea. Not the largest. There's not really small crocodilians alive today. There were a lot smaller species in the past. But for our modern group, that's about as small as they usually get. The largest species.
However disappointing this may sound to all the reptile pet hobbyists out there who are listening to this.
Well, if you can get a nice Cuvier's dwarf caiman, then you have a unicorn, because my understanding is no dwarf caiman is nice. They're just ornery little bastards.
They are absolute, cranky little bastards that are very nice to look at, but you're gonna have a pretty tough time trying to interact with them once it gets to the certain maintenance, let's just say, aspects of keeping and looking after the animal. And it almost doesn't matter how long you can be around it. Apparently, even some keepers who have been around some individuals long enough from their infancy, they still get bit. So one bite, can already be enough to leave a mark, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to get to that bit in a minute, too. So we talked about the smallest. We should talk about the largest species, because it's hard not to, right? The largest species are saltwater crocodiles today. And then the largest on record would be a very famous saltwater crocodile called the Long. It was found a few years back, almost like 8 years back now, it seems. And he is officially recorded at 6.17 meters in length and 1,075 kilograms in weight. So he was a very large animal.
Right.
And in the past, saltwater crocodiles like Lolong were not as rare as they are today. and probably did get even a little bit larger than that. And by the past, I'm talking like 1950s. Like we wouldn't have to go that far in the past to find larger crocodiles, but there was a fair amount of culling that happened, and it was they were another group that was at the risk of extinction, and then through coordinated conservation efforts, really bounced back, which is good. So some stuff to think about with crocodiles, aside from being very large, they also have this very flattened skull table, right? So that's the bones that cover the brain case. So
Right.
in humans, right, we have a very sort of dome-shaped skull, and that's true for a lot of other animals too. That it's more of a sort of roundish convexity to the skull. In crocodiles, it's much more flattened, almost like a triangle or like a rectangle. And that's probably related to the fact that one thing that we see with all crocodilians today is that they're all semi-aquatic. So they all live in the water, around the water, spend a lot of time in the water. Some species more than others. A lot of these dwarf species that we're talking about, like Paleozookas, they actually spend a lot of time on land and seems to be doing something on land that we're not entirely sure about because they're very secretive. But then you have other animals on the opposite side, like Gerials, where as adults, they're pretty much almost always in the water, and they can't even lift their bodies off the ground when they're on land. So they're much more like seals. So
Right.
something to do with being in the water. A lot of hunting in the water, and because of that, they have to move their jaws fast through the water, and so their jaws have been adapted to, their whole skull has been adapted, or has evolved to cut through water very, very easily, right? So we're looking at a much more hydrodynamic shape at the skull, lets them move their heads sideways in the water very fast.
And this allows them
So
to close in on their swimming prey, which in most cases is probably going to be fish, given
yes,
on the
yeah.
the morphology of the jaws. I don't think that these kind of things, for probably good reasons, would be able to take down something like a turtle with those jaws. So I would
Well, so it's
expect.
funny you bring up turtle, because one of the things that crocodiles are known for, and again, members of your channel and Discord are no doubt well aware of it, is that crocodiles are known for having extremely strong bite force. Like they're the top of the heap when it comes to bite force, both relative to body size and just overall. Like they have developed jaw muscles that work in such a way that they can really pack a punch even on skulls that are very long. The only animals in crocodile, so there's work from Greg Erickson back in 2012. He's really the guy that like did a lot of this work. I mean, Mason Mears did in the past as well, so gotta give points to that too. But Erickson went through with bite force transducers and had every known species of crocodilian at the time bite it. So we have data on all of them. And then with his students in the past, such as Paul Gignac, they went through and they dissected a lot of these animals so we could look at how their skulls are put together and how the muscles are pulling on it. And yeah, it's just the crocodilian skull. Like that is, if it's one thing that the group is known for, it's that strong bite force. And we can actually map, to a degree, its evolution throughout the group, including starting in animals that were remarkably small and probably didn't need to bite all that hard, and yet could definitely bite hard.
So what
And one
about
of
the
the reasons I
gharial
bring it
though?
up,
Like the gharial
uh,
itself, would that be an exception, or would they still be able, despite their rather misleading and fragile looks potentially, would they still be able to pack quite a punch?
so so in Erickson's study, he did mention that the only animal that showed less bite force related to body size compared to all other crocodilians was the gharials. So they do show a reduction in bite force. Now, having said that, the bite force that they produce is still humongous compared to what you would see if like it was like a similar sized mammal. So humongous that if they didn't just hunt fish, that they would have the potential to actually break their entire jaw just with their jaw muscles. And indeed, there are known instances of male gharials getting in fights with another and one or both of them just shearing off a chunk of their jaw
Oof.
in the process. So they've made their jaws super thin as adaptations for catching fish, but it has come at a cost in that those are also not super weak, but definitely much more prone to breaking than other crocodilians.
So, in other words, if you are a male gharial and you're not really sure if you can truly stand up to your rival, you might be better off walking away, or else you might end up basically being almost downright disabled for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's don't get in a jousting match with a gharial with another gharial, because there's a chance one of you is definitely going to be missing a jaw by the end of it.
Yeah.
But you know, they're guys. They're rutting. They're not carrying at the time.
It's
That's
true.
how it goes.
They're
But yes,
living in
very
the
strong
moment.
jaws. Exactly. What else can we say about them? They're all crocodilians walk on 4 limbs, so they're all quadrupedal. If you note, the hind limbs of crocodilians do stand taller than the front limbs, and that has been used as a suggestion that they descended from bipedal ancestors. We now, with better fossil data, can say that that actually is probably true, in the sense that early archosaurs seem to have been bipedal, at least partially, and then some moved into a quadrupedal stance later on. So there's a little bit of evidence for that. But yeah, so front limbs, they have 5 digits on the front, and they have 4 digits on the back. Interestingly, both the front and the hind limbs only have claws on 3 of their 4 or 5 digits, and the rest are just kind of like little fleshy fingers. And you can follow that shape. That pattern looks very similar to what we see in what you see in dinosaurs as well, where you can see how a 5 or 4 digit animal could become more of a 3 digit animal as it goes. You can see which digits were on their way out.
Yeah, that's definitely somewhat prominent in some dinosaur groups, specifically theropods as well, but we do have that in other groups too, where you can definitely look it up and find some kind of interesting observations.
Less talked about, and I guess I should bring it up because it popped in my head, is there are the carpal bones that make up your wrist. In humans, it's a series of 8 kind of blocky shaped bones. But in modern crocodilians, 2 of those bones, called the radial and the ulnar, have actually grown long. Like, so they've grown out to look like almost little tiny arm bones. So they've extended the length of the wrist in modern crocodilians. The reason behind it has been hypothesized to be because earlier, prior to our modern day crocodilians, these animals were much more terrestrial, and that this may have been a means of kind of extending the length of their legs when they're running, and that this is just kind of an old holdover that we see in modern day crocs, which is interesting, and definitely has some appeal. But it does make crocodile wrists very identifiable, which is kind of neat. The other thing I would say about crocodilians is the big thing that you'll notice about them is the variability in the length of the skull.
Right.
So some have very flat, wide skulls like alligators or Nile crocodiles, and then others have the super thin skull. We talked about the gharials. And then in the past, there were others that had extremely wide skulls that were flat and full of tiny, tiny teeth that has been hypothesized to have been used for like filter feeding.
So they are the extinct types like the Stomatosuchids, or possibly some of the even Caymanina species of the Miocene from South America, I believe. There were some, like Mortality, for example.
Yeah, that one I have to double check, but yes, it's
when we get into the extinct,
changes in shape,
we will be able to look at them. I'm sure we can definitely look at them, since they're actually very interesting. There's a lot to talk about in their ecosystem, but we'll definitely do that in the next, I mean, not in this video, but when we obviously get to the extinct animals, which, let's be honest, everybody is listening here they want to get
Open to
through
hear about
this
the
one.
extinct ones, definitely.
They're already like thinking, okay, so when are we gonna be able to get through this so that we can then get to the extinct ones? Come on, guys, like just get it out there. But patience, please. It will be there.
It will be there, definitely. But yeah, it's just these types of shape that we see in modern crocodilians, where the snout changes, we see in the past as well, and these different shapes evolved multiple times throughout their history. So these have been very common shapes. There's always been a crocodilian of some kind living at this semi-aquatic water's edge, swamp-like lifestyle throughout, at least since the Jurassic period. So they've held that spot really well, and I think it's a large reason for why they've lived as long as they have. Because even though they spread out to do all these other different things that we'll talk about in a future video, those different species always wind up dying out often due to mass extinction events. But the sort of that core crocodile body plan that lives at that water's edge, that whole swampy semi-aquatic area seems to be particularly resistant to extinction. So it's a good sort of fallback spot. So it's kind of like where you get these sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like not stem cell, but like a sort of like a common spot for crocodilians to sort of branch off and diversify from over and over again.
So it's almost like taking a step back and then taking a step forward, but in a different direction after this one. Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah?
It's like there's always a collection of species that are hanging out in a pretty safe spot that the group can pull from at later times to go into other directions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So what else do we have on here?
So we've covered
so diet.
I got a species before we get to diet. In fact, you could actually transition this into the diet, because I was going to ask whether or not there is a lot of variation that can be observed in the skulls from single species, so within the species itself. As in, let's say if we take any sample from, whether be it cougar dwarf caiman, or whether it be saltwater crocodile or an American alligator, can we observe a variation of their skulls and how they look just within just one species? Let's say American alligator, do they display the diversity of looks in terms of their skulls, or do they tend to be very consistent on average? And basically apply the same kind of question and model to all the other known species. Would you be able to comment anything on that, and then move on to the diet as well?
There is variation between the skulls, often in the amount of texturing that you'll see on the skull, so the bones of the skull. We didn't really talk too much about it, but as you note, like if you look at crocodile skulls, they tend to be pretty well textured, like they're almost like they've been carved out of something. And in older crocodilians, that texturing tends to be more prominent, and in wild crocodilians, it tends to be more prominent. You can usually tell the difference between a captive raised animal and a wild animal based on how the snout is shaped. There's not a lot of variation, not too much variation in like snout width within a species. They all tend to be pretty wide in general, but captive species do tend to have more of a splay to their teeth, so their teeth don't quite align as well as in wild animals. And then there's also a tendency for the snout to be turned upward a bit. So an upward turned snout, which has been hypothesized to have something to do with them being raised in artificial pools where they're resting their heads against concrete, so it winds up sort of causing a bit of an upturned swing to the snout. So you can tell the difference between at least a captive raised animal and a wild animal. And then there's some individual variation it's a small variation, but one that you can still tell.
Okay, that makes sense. Yes, interesting. So we even have these kind of things that can, well, basically, it's not a surprising thing, so I shouldn't be surprised to hear that when you have an animal that is captive bred versus wild, they would definitely display different features that would probably be a result of their adaptation to the environment where they are, be it captive or wild.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask, since we are obviously on our first hour, whether or not we can take a quick break, and then we will be with you guys shortly. You will obviously not know anything since I'm only gonna be pausing it, but yeah, we will continue where we left off in a moment. So stay tuned with us, guys, for a second, please. Alright guys, you would not have probably been waiting too long, not nearly as long as me and Jay had to, but we're back from our so-called commercial break. So Jason, once again apologies, and please continue what you were saying earlier on, where we left off.
Yeah, no problem. We'll round out the croc stuff and move on to birds. We're just quick things on diet and habitat. As I already mentioned, they all have some kind of semi-aquatic habitat to them. So all crocodilians live around water, and many of them spend a lot of their time in water. Diet is carnivorous across the board, so they all eat meat of some kind. Many of them are very avid fish eaters, so some only eat fish or crustaceans, so around that. And then there's only a few that would be considered like your hypercarnivores, so the type that would really, the ones that we really associate crocodilians with, so the ones that eat cows and take on wildebeests and stuff like that. And those are your Nile crocodiles, your saltwater crocodiles, mugger crocodiles, things like that. But then we have like, oh geez, it just occurs to me, I know the taxonomic names, and I had to think about what their other names are. But like slender-snouted crocodiles, African slender-snouted crocodiles, Gerials, obviously, Temistoma, the false Gerial, Orinoco crocodiles. They are more heavily on the fish side. There are reports of alligators and caiman eating fruits every now and again. So I would not say that fruit is not on the menu. Like if they had access to it, they probably would. All crocodilians are opportunistic, so they will take advantage of a food source if it's available.
I have a
And
question about that, by the way, that just came up, and an interesting observation that you have just noted, since obviously without the direct observation, these things would have never been documented, obviously,
right.
meaning that somebody actually saw them going for the fruit. Now, my question would be, could this be somehow related to to a similar reasoning behind this potential display of feeding? Like dogs and cats, sometimes they chew on grass, or they even almost eat grass for a variety of reasons, which I don't always understand, but the common explanations I heard at least were that they either try to extract the juices to help to diversify for the digestion, or they also use it to maybe just clean their mouth a bit from the bacteria that might be get stuck from the leftover of food. So it could be both of these things. So what sort of reasoning do you believe, unless it's just as blatant as just simply wanting to eat something different, what could they have to gain from eating fruit? You know, being even just basically strictly carnivore, all of a sudden just eating fruit. So what do you think would happen in that sense? What is there to gain for them?
It's possible that there is a fiber component to it to help clean out their system. Crocodilians and reptiles in general, and like I'm tossing birds in there with it, are known to eat dirt and just like seek out rocks as roughage. And the hypothesis behind that has been that it does aid in digestion. In the case of certain bird species, it's there to help with gastric mill, to help them actually break down food. But also, it just seems to provide access to minerals that they might not be getting as much of from the food that they're eating. As for the fruit in particular, it's aside from the fiber aspect and yeah, potentially interest in juices. My suspicion is that the animals are doing it because they like the taste of the fruit. Like
Mm-hmm.
they have a sense of sweetness, so they would recognize what sweet tastes like, and it's possible that they just like it because they like this sweet taste. I mean, the nice thing about fruit is it's readily available and it has evolved to be eaten. Like it is there to entice animals to eat it anyway. So, and it has a fleshy taste to it anyway. So I think that can also help if you're a carnivore working your way
I
back
think
into
the important thing to also note about the fruit that even though the ripe fruit generally tastes sweet in most cases, as you correctly pointed out, and that is the case obviously in the vast majority of fruit across the board, with few exceptions perhaps there and then, but fruit do contain a lot of acids, do they not? And could they be
yeah,
playing a part in this whole process?
they could. It's it is an interesting area. It was these are observational studies that were originally made in like on crocodile farms and in zoos. Um, so it's a thing we know that they will seek out now and then, but it's still fairly new, and the reasoning behind it, I don't think has really been tackled all that much, other than that it is another component of the diet that they could take advantage of, and probably that you don't want to feed them fruit too often. But I mean, people shouldn't eat fruit too often either, so it's just
That's
a
actually
thing.
a good point, as much as we are used to the idea, but I believe this could be related to how we encounter certain problems related to dental problems and maybe many other problems, which obviously is not the purpose of this video, but nevertheless, well pointed out as well that if you have pet reptiles, even if they do sometimes like to have a bit of fruit, only give them a little bit.
Don't overfeed them the fruit. Yeah. Don't give your poor little pets diabetes.
Exactly. And potentially don't send them to the dentist either, although their tooth replacement kind of saves them from that a little bit, which is not something we humans can boast about.
Right.
Now,
Yeah. So
you mentioned
croc.
dietary, obviously that they are carnivorous, and and obviously with the occasional fruit. Do we have any evidence of any kind that you can think of any other non-carnivorous dietary occurrences, that you can make note of, maybe something that was documented because it could have been obviously for obvious reasons considered unusual. Like, does anything come to your mind when you think of something like that?
For crocodiles or
Yes, yes, for
crocodilians,
crocodilians, yes.
weird things they eat. Nothing comes to mind other than them occasionally, like, grabbing pieces of plastic or a piece of metal that happens to have been in their way when they're biting down on stuff. Though, if I remember right, Chris Gillette, uh, formerly of Gator Boys fame, now has a very popular Facebook page and YouTube channel. He does a lot of videos where he's feeding the crocodiles at, I think it's Everglades Adventure or something like that, where he works. And he's feeding his alligators. And there was one video he did recently where he fed them, or he went to feed them something, and he fed them, I think it was something sour or something, and the alligator like took a bite and just like spat it out. And it
Mm.
was just like a nice reminder that they do have senses of taste, and that if they don't like something, they'll just not eat it.
That's very interesting. I mean, it would be very interesting to see this. I'll need to look it up later sometime if I can, if I don't forget as well. Because I'm actually curious to see how they would actually do it, when they reject the food and they're just like, nah, not having it.
It is you can see a moment of realization in their face when they're like they bite down and they're like, nope, and off it goes.
And speaking of another thing that maybe you could also elaborate, and am I right at saying that um, Archosaurs, the extant Archosaurs, by the way, because if I were to say it as a whole, that would actually be making a very gross mistake for the reasons I will elaborate shortly. They bite and swallow their food whole, as they do, right? They don't actually chew it, to grind it. And the reason I said extant archosaurs, later I corrected myself, because we know that there are species of other archosaurs from extinct branches
You're
who
correct.
specialized in grinding and chopping up, or you could say like just grinding down and thinning down the amount of food, you know, that they consume to make it easier for the digestion and processing, right? So modern
Correct,
day
yes.
archosaurs, however, I have not noticed whether or not they ever actually chew their food. They actually don't think are even equipped to do it, are they?
Yeah, the crocodiles or crocodilians will take large chunks of food and swallow it whole. Birds will also they'll take smaller pieces because they're smaller animals, and they can separate it a little bit, but they can't do too much mastication, so chewing in the mouth, and so they wind up swallowing a lot of their food whole too. For granivorous birds, so the birds that eat grains and are much more herbivorous, they will, as I alluded to earlier, swallow rocks
Mm-hmm.
that will sit in a specialized part of their stomach called the gizzard. Crocodilians have a gizzard as well. It just doesn't. It's not as active as what we see in granivorous birds, but that this basically, or crocodiles have a gizzard-like section of their stomach. It's not as well partitioned as you see in birds. But the point is that gizzard is where they store the rocks, and the rocks are used to help pulverize the food down and gain access to nutrients that the birds otherwise would have probably missed if they just swallowed the seeds and moved on. So there's more of a post-oral or beyond the mouth chewing that goes on in birds. And then in crocodilians, there's not a lot of need to do it, in part because if you eat meat, you don't have to do a lot of pulverizing to begin with because it's already in a much more digestible state to begin with. But crocodilians make the most of it by having extremely acidic stomach acid that lets them really break down pretty much everything that they eat. So
Could this include the
they eat.
pieces of bone that get stuck there and then when they say if they take off a leg or whatever limb of some animal that they're trying to eat and they swallow
Yeah,
a couple
so
of
it
pieces
will
of bones?
dissolve the bone as well.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so they take out bone, hooves, claws. A lot of that tends to go. We have only recently come to recognize that the only thing that actually doesn't seem to break down as well is hair.
Mm-hmm.
So things like hair and feathers. And so alligators are known to produce hairballs that they will later upchuck somewhere else to get rid of it.
Mm.
Sometimes they can be pretty large too.
And this is a result of them probably swallowing something small enough whole which had a lot of hair on it, probably, I would imagine. Some kind of rodent perhaps that wasn't lucky, or a baby animal.
A lot of rodents tend to be eaten. Yeah, nutria are very popular rodents. They're fairly like large rat-like rodents that seem to form a regular part of alligator diets.
Yeah.
So
Poor
animals
critters.
so they wind up getting stuck in their stomach, and then their stomach just compresses it all into one nasty hairball, and then just barf it up.
I almost feel like making a meme about a wizard gator, just basically, you know, consuming a nutria and then basically as a and it gets transformed into like a hairball and just like puts like a, you know, magician's hat on its top of the head and just like write something like focus pocus. But of course I could come up with something better if I were to sit on it a little longer, so pardon if it sounds like it lands a little bit flat, but you get where I'm coming from though, don't you?
Yeah, it's like a really nasty version of Frosty the Snowman, except now
Yes.
it's a hairball.
Yeah, that's basically the idea.
Oof. I am jumping around a bit, but we also see this kind of hairball bit happening in birds, especially in owls. So they eat a lot of mice, and even though they can use a gizzard to help break down a lot of the bones and such on the mice, usually it just winds up taking up space inside their stomach along with the hair, and so it all gets mushed together, and they barf out little owl pellets.
So with the crocodilians, since we have started talking about the digestive tracts and stuff like this, what can we say about their dentary just generally all of the dentary related issues, such as maybe the basic ideas of the structure and also the replacement, and just describe what can we say about that.
Yeah, they have, depending on the species, they have a set assortment of teeth that you can use to help identify the individual species in the skull. So you can count how many maxillary and premaxillary teeth there are versus dentary, so lower jaw teeth. The teeth are set in pretty deeply rooted sockets, so that they have what's called thecodont dentition. Right? So the teeth are set in sockets, and then the replacement teeth come in and help push them out, and they basically replace their teeth throughout their lives. We have noticed and this is harder to say for certain, but we have noticed in older crocodilians, all of which we know basically only from animals kept in captivity, but that in these older captive crocs, that replacement rate does seem to slow as they get older, and there are a handful of pretty old crocodilians that are in captivity today that have almost no teeth at all. Like their replacement rates have gotten so slow that they've lost more teeth than they've had the ability to grow back. But that I put that with the caveat that it's hard to say whether or not this has something to do with them being in captivity and the food they're eating, and like perhaps lack of the proper nutrients to help with tooth replacement, or if this is a thing that we'd actually see in older crocodilians, but it's really hard to tell the age of a wild croc. Like we assume all the big ones are really old, but it's only an assumption. Like once the animals are in their 20s, like the
It could
size
be
they are
anywhere
not
basically
much
within
size
the
of the
yeah. And speaking of replacement in crocodilians, does a broken or potentially sick tooth automatically trigger a replacement cycle for that tooth, or does it have to? Does the animal basically have to wait until it occurs by itself, and until then has to endure the potential inconveniences or maybe even pain of having to deal with that bad tooth? Let's just say for whatever reason, if it gets the bad tooth.
I mean, if they have an infected tooth, there's the risk that it can work its way retrograde into the jaw and cause pathology that just eats into the bone of the jaw. Crocodilians are pretty resilient to a lot of that stuff. I think the fact that you spend your life living in like swampy territory that's just laced with bacteria produces a remarkably tough immune system. So they don't usually have to worry about that. If they break a tooth while eating, I'm not sure if it triggers an increase in tooth replacement at that point, because I wouldn't be surprised, and I suspect that tooth replacement is going to happen on schedule regardless of whether a tooth is broken. So they're probably going to be stuck waiting for that tooth to grow back, or not grow back, but get replaced. We do see this kind of replacement patterning happening in other reptiles as well. So you can go to the lizard side, and even though their teeth are designed a bit or shaped a bit differently, they're not fully thecodont, you could say. They still replace their teeth in waves, regardless of whether the tooth is broken ahead of time. So I suspect it's going to be the same for the crocodilians, but I'm not entirely sure.
Right. So basically, if the tooth is broken and it has to wait for it to get, replaced, it would. Let's just say if it broke right at the base, then it would be stuck there waiting for the old root of this tooth that got stuck in there to get pushed out by the new tooth, essentially. And until then, it's got a gap there that is gonna be practically useless for all intents and purposes. So, would they swallow their old and replaced teeth, by the way, as a means to potentially recycle, or do the old replaced, fallen out teeth hold no nutritional value whatsoever to them?
I don't think that they would seek out eating their teeth if they fell out, but I fully suspect that they would typically swallow those teeth, because if the tooth broke out while you're eating an animal, that tooth's probably stuck inside the animal you're about to swallow.
Right. So basically, we all we can say is that by accident, if you say by proxy, these things are commonly probably happening anyway, because if the tooth is fairly weak now and is quite loose because it's been pushed out, there's a very good chance that when it feeds onto something and applies a lot of strength, it's gonna get stuck anyway. So it would be consuming it just through that anyway. So interesting thing I wanted to find out is whether or not there are sightings of shed crocodile and alligator teeth in their habitats that could be discovered by people who spend, you know, like say if it's like a local ranger or someone else who just spends time there studying their environments. Do they come across their shed teeth frequently, or is this not something that you can find quite a lot?
You can usually find it. If you do find them, they're going to be near the water's edge, because that's usually where the event's going to take place.
Mhm.
And in some habitat where you know there's a crocodilian around. It could also, if it happens in the water, it could get washed downstream. So yeah, you could come across one every now and then. Replacement rates in crocodilians are nowhere near as high as what you'd see in sharks. So it's not like you would come across almost an entire like beach full of the teeth. But
Right, yeah.
you come across one or two teeth every now and then.
Right. So it is possible to go and do some crocodile or alligator tooth hunting, basically, if you were to find some for collections. I've seen some people have teeth, but I never actually knew how they acquired them, whether or not they took them off the dead animals, maybe when they were already there, and or from captivity. Obviously, in captivity, when animals die, they probably use their bones and skulls as either just, well, you could say as far as decoration or maybe as educational exhibit potentially, and some people might
Yeah, I
probably
think if
wear
it's
them.
yeah, you can't if it's from a captive animal, it's a lot easier to find the replacement teeth. And so a lot of places, I think you'll wind up getting teeth from places like that, especially if it's like a crocodile farm or somewhere where they can probably just sweep up loads of teeth all the time and just use that as a selling tool. Depending on how put together that tooth is, it'll give you an idea of whether or not it came from a living animal. Because if it's from a dead animal, after the periodontal ligaments decay, the teeth get really loose in the skull, and so it's easy to just pull a tooth out of a dried skull. It is an issue that actually comes up a lot with dried skulls of crocodilians, is that their teeth tend to fall out, so you have to be extra careful with them.
Yeah, and one other thing I wanted to ask, and that's obviously one of the things I'm gonna bring up on the screen shortly, and while I prepare it, I wanted to just do a very old school, if you will, cliche question. Well, let's look at the differences between the crocodile and alligator.
Let's do that. Yeah, it's pretty mostly straightforward. This gets harder to what we use to tell apart a modern day crocodile and alligator is harder to do in extinct animals as they start to converge on similar skull shapes. But at least with modern animals, it's pretty straightforward to tell them apart.
Right. So yes, I've got an image right now, and I will quickly drop it into our chat as well, so you know which one I'm looking at. So it's this one right here, and
Yes, classic.
yeah, the classic. Yes, I was gonna say it's the classic one. Yeah. So anything you can comment on in regards to something? What stands out to me from the side view, if you were to look at the side view, the most is the texture and rugosity on the snout, of how different it is between the gator and the croc. When you look at these ridges that kind of are formed at the base of the teeth on the croc, and compare them to the gator. So is there actually any explanation for this, or is it just basically something that it is what it is and that's all we know? Is there a functionality, let's just say aspect related behind
Functionality
this?
for that is up in the air. We're not sure why. This is a thing I mentioned earlier. Actually, let me know if I blip out. I shouldn't blip out, but I'm just gonna make sure that my internet is keeping up.
Yeah, I was a little nervous earlier on, a couple moments ago, that I lost you, but you came back in time, so I decided to just let it go for the time being. But yeah,
There we go. Okay,
right.
so that should help. Um, but yeah, older crocodilians, like older animals, tend to have much gnarlier skulls, so there's just much more texture to the skull bone itself. There is this there is a pattern of bone resorption and deposition that happens in crocodiles or crocodile. It happens in all animals, but on the skull of crocodilians, it happens a lot. And the pattern seems to change as they get older, where the amount of resorption might exceed the amount of deposition in some areas. So you start finding with these like caverns and chasms, and just this really textured look to the animals. Why it happens, we're not sure. I haven't heard any good hypothesis for why that seems to happen. It is a good way to tell an old adult from a young adult, but aside from that, we're not sure why they exactly have the textures that they do. It's possible it has something to do with moving bite force stress more efficiently around the skull, or perhaps more inefficiently, like creating sinks for the extra stress to go so it doesn't affect the rest of the skull. But that has not really been tested, because that requires a level of detail in the skull that has not yet been tested with like a finite element analysis.
And
But yeah,
looking at this one as well, I'm also noticing another quite obvious difference is that the way the teeth are visible, the visibility of the teeth in a gator, they only show the top teeth, while the bottom teeth are only visible in some cases only on a crocodile.
yeah, that is the big separation between the two. Is alligators have an overbite and crocodiles have much more of an interlacing tooth battery. So the teeth from the lower jaw tend to interact with the teeth from the upper jaw a bit more often. The biggest difference that tends to hold up in the fossils as well is whether or not the fourth tooth of the lower jaw can be seen. So in crocodilians, you can see that fourth tooth popping up. There's even a little bit of a constriction between the premaxilla and maxilla in that crocodile image that makes it extra clear that where that fourth tooth is. Whereas in alligators and in caiman, you wouldn't see that fourth tooth. It would be hidden inside the skull, or not hidden, but it would be covered up by the upper jaw going on top of it. So
Right.
yeah, that tends to be the big difference.
And of course, the top view puts it in a more perspective of the width, obviously, the skull width and snout width as well, specifically. Although, interestingly enough, if this image is true to scale, which I believe it might not be if they're looking at animals of similar age, because wouldn't saltwater crocodile have a slightly longer skull than the alligator if they were both animals of a similar age? Or would they be
It
very
would have a
similar?
yeah, it would have a longer skull. I mean, the image in this, it's I mean, it's hard to say because it's a drawing,
Yeah.
but yeah, I would probably have made that skull a little bit wider in the saltwater crocodile, but not too much wider. They do tend to be a little bit thinner. Trying to find a good image of a Nile crocodile, because Nile crocodiles tend to have thicker skulls than saltwater crocodiles.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
And then mugger crocodiles have remarkably thick skulls. They almost look like alligators. Just do.
So with a mugger crocodile, I am obviously I'm waiting for you to send the image in, but once you do, before you do, I am going to make a guess that the mugger crocodile will display similar features to what we see in this drawing, in terms of how it will stand out from the gator. in that sense. So the tooth, you know, arrangement would be like what we see in this saltwater crocodile drawing.
Yeah, you should still be able to see that fourth tooth. There's this nice little constriction. You see that like subnarial gap almost in Crocodilians. That really is a good spot to house that fourth tooth.
All right.
And I'd love to find a good image that is not.
If you don't have the image, then I mean, I suppose we can either continue.
They are interesting.
Oh,
I feel like mugger crocodiles tend to get overshadowed a lot.
Yeah, that's actually true. I don't hear a lot about them. It's always either the Salties or the Niles.
Yeah, they are big crocodiles, but they are not as big as Niles or as saltwater crocodiles. They live in India, so they share space with tigers, which is pretty cool, and also with Gerials, but
that's also, I think, there's been, now that you say that, I'm starting to remember that there have been confrontations cited between these two as well, the tigers and the muggers. The only thing that I've seen once is how a tiger, I think it was a tigress, or was it a tiger, I'm not sure which one it was, that killed a pretty big mugger crocodile, and it was a video of it somewhere as well. But I wouldn't be able to attest whether or not this is something that would have happened most of the times, as in the tiger would more likely be the winner in this kind of confrontation, if they were to kind of go like that, or does it kind of go back and forth depending on, obviously, whether or not the crocodile might have not been very healthy individual and was an easy target perhaps for the tiger?
Yeah, with things like that, it's always...
It's a bit too murky to
understand. So dependent on just, you know, the animal at the time, how hungry it was, or how desperate it was, what's the size difference between them. I don't usually get into the who'd win in a fight stuff that
yeah, I'm the same, yeah.
Doesn't, like, it's hard to say because it just varies so much, really depending on just who wanted it more at the time. But I do remember that video you're talking about. Well, that kind of, alright, that might work. It's smaller than I'd like, but that's fine.
I've got an interesting image of two mugger crocodiles together that I wanted to share as well, so I'm going to send it to you first, and I'm gonna also put it up on display for the people to see as well. And
you gotta do a shot of it from above. That's a little bit better. Oh, that one's scratching his neck too. So
yeah, I was going to say that looks very cool, but there's another thing that I'm noticing, and I'm wondering if this is a legit observation or is it just basically to do with the environmental things, you know, like the water or maybe fungus getting stuck to it, but the color differences and the tint differences, you know, in their skin, individual variation, or is the one that's the greener one maybe just has a bit of fungus or of some kind stuck to it as a result of just being in a swamp or something like that?
There probably is. There will be variation between the individuals in their coloration a little bit. I think in this instance we probably are seeing a lot of algae growing on top of the
algae, yeah, that's what I was going to say, algae.
Yeah, because there's bits on the side of the leg and the head where it looks a little bit clearer. So might be why it's scratching itself so much, because it's like, that aches.
Yep, giving it a bit of an itch. Although it's very hard to say as well, because there are some clear bits that I don't see anything particularly sticking out aside from the obvious ones. You know how on the top of the back, at the base of its hips, basically, you know, like right between its legs actually, you can see that there's something dark and it goes almost all the way up to the back in some cases. So that looks like it could be some algae, but...
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yep, it certainly could be that.
So it's, but I'm still kind of curious. Look at the snouts as well. I mean, one of them looks like it has a slightly yellowish kind of beige snout, while the other one is just a bit more plain, kind of well, under this tint at least, looks like a bit of a grayish purple.
Okay, so I did send one picture along. It's a little hard to see. This picture though, that makes it much clearer.
Okay.
Well, good. It came across as unknown. Let's try that. Oh, right there it goes. Yeah, there it is.
Okay,
So you can see just how chunky that skull is.
Right, I'm going to save it in a second so that we can show our viewers this other image. So now that you guys seen this image of a mother crocodile scratching itself, now let's have a look at this one. This is a very interesting capture, by the way, and first of all I'd like to ask, what is it doing? Is it just resting that way, or is it preparing for something?
In that individual, it probably is alert. So it's resting outside of the water, but it definitely has his head up. And so he's probably paying attention possibly to the keeper or the photographer. But yeah, it looks like he's just got up on the land right now and just kind of figuring out where he wants to go from there.
And you mentioned the skull, so we can see, am I right to say that the skull, does it look somewhat taller than you would normally expect of a typical crocodile, if you will?
It looks about right. It's got that just very, very large, solid look to it. Like you can see the mugger crocodile in the water next to him too. Like you can see it,
yes, there we go.
That skull is big. It's still covering most of what we see. Which is to say, I guess when we're talking about unique features of crocodilians, the other thing is, of course, that the movement to make the head more hydrodynamic also has pushed the eyes and the ears and the nose all to the top of the skull,
Right.
allowing them to stay submerged and most of their body hidden.
So basically, this would be going into the next potential segment, hunting tactics of the crocodilians. So what can you say about that? There probably won't be a lot to say because they would probably be pretty universal to most of them, but with a few variations. So do you have any comments on their hunting strategies?
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about that. Like I said, most crocodilians are piscivorous, so they eat fish, and so a lot of that is going to be things we don't see as often, but that would involve the animals resting at the water surface or just below the water with their mouths open and waiting for a fish to swim by and snapping down as they do, or if the fish is closer nearby, they can rapidly move their heads to the side to grab it. A unique feature to Eusuchians and possibly to crocodile, depending on how far up it goes, is these structures called integumentary sense organs.
Right.
So these are small little pits along the side of the face on the skulls of alligators, and then on the skulls and all along the body of crocodilians or of crocodilids.
Right.
That they are super sensitive to pressure changes. So they act kind of like underwater ears, or the lateral line you see in fish. So when there's movement in the water, the animals can figure out where the movement's coming from, how big of an animal is making that movement, and how close by it is. And so that's an area that they can use a lot when they're living in murky waters. So a lot of the areas that a lot of these crocodilians live in are not particularly clean or clear water. So having the ability to see without seeing comes in really handy. And they use that to their advantage when they're hunting for prey underwater. The hypercarnivorous taxa, of course, get all the airplay on National Geographic. So we're kind of well aware of how that works. They will be by the water's edge. They'll look like a floating log. They'll slowly work their way up to a potential food source, and then they'll launch from the water to attack. That launching from the water can be straightforward, but it's often from the side. So they can launch their bodies forward, but they turn their head to the side. And that's where a lot of that power comes in. And they snap down, drag the prey into the water, and try to drown it.
Death rolls?
There is some evidence of some crocodilians hunting on land. It's definitely seems more opportunistic, but they will come out on land and kind of do the same kind of ambush style where they'll try to get near particularly well-trafficked area and wait for an animal to come by, and then they'll try and attack it from there. And there is something that should be mentioned is even though we associate ambushing with crocodiles almost as like the lazy way to hunt, there's a lot more of forethought into it. So they patrol the riverbanks, figuring out areas where animals are going to come to drink. They're really good at long-term memory, so they keep tabs of what animals come by to drink at what time of day, and they use that to set up a potential, basically trapping site where they are the trap, and then they'll wait for the prey to come by there. Again, as I think it was a shout out to Chris Gillette who talked about it. If you are, or it might have been Adam Britton, I think it was Chris Gillette. Anyway, it's if you're living in Florida and you walk along the same path every day with your little dog, and that happens to be a path by a body of water that an alligator has set up shop in, you should change your walking habits a bit, either to be less near the water or to not show up at the same time of day, because the animal will figure out the time of day you typically walk by, and eventually your fluffy little poodle might disappear one day.
And get turned into a hairball.
He has to get turned to a hairball.
So, yeah. This is very interesting, and does this somehow potentially challenge this whole maybe stereotype that all crocodiles were dumb, you know? And does this particularly, what you have described, does this actually even make them smart, or is there another way to explain this?
I would say that, yeah, I would not call them dumb. I would say that there is intelligence there, and that it is one that we're slowly coming to recognize. A lot of zookeepers in places like St. Augustine, Alligator Farm, and Gatorland and Adventures and stuff,
yep.
Places like that where they work with crocs all the time, they have become well aware that these are animals that can be trained pretty easily. You're not going to have them jumping through hoops, or at least no one's tried to do that yet. But you can target train them. You can tell them to go to certain places. They learn to recognize keepers. They learn to recognize when you're coming in for food versus coming in to just clean or train. They can be taught their names. So they have.
That's the interesting one, by the way. Now that you said about the names, I remember watching a lot of the Gatorland videos on their YouTube channel and on Instagram as well. I'm subscribed to both of their. I'm following them in both platforms, and sometimes they actually call some of their individuals by their names, and they actually respond to it.
Yes. So they have a good sense of hearing. They can hear. They have pretty wide range of hearing. It doesn't get too high into the kilohertz or high frequency ranges, but that's true for all reptiles and true for almost all birds, or I should say almost all reptiles and almost all birds. So there's a couple exceptions, but for the most part, all of the reptile or Sauropsida group is really geared towards lower frequency ranges. Things we haven't talked about yet are the reproduction and the fact that crocodilians and birds, so as Archosaurs as a group, show some degree of parental care. So they guard the nests and they take care of the young for at least a little bit of time post-hatching.
So let's
for some species.
With the reproduction, how about, I'm sorry if I interrupted, but I wanted to propose to start from the very beginning. So the first engagement, let's say, prior to mating, and then like what do they do when they try to attract a mate? How do they select them? How is there a hierarchy that they have of any kind of structure of sort, depending on the species maybe? Do they form groups, harems, or pairs for life or temporary? And then obviously go into the details of how they actually, from the process of laying eggs and all of these things, just basically take it step by step in that sort of layout, if that's okay for you, of course.
Sure. It'll depend on your species, but there's some degree of like peacocking or showing off for females to the females from the males. A lot of species tend to have one dominant male for a group of females, and then various subordinate males. So it's almost a little bit like how seals are set up, where there's a large male that sort of is in charge, and then a bunch of subordinate males that try to sneak in there, here and there, which can lead to very epic battles. All the worst damage that we see in crocodiles comes from other crocodiles attacking them. There is a sort of a sweet side to it as well. So away from the violent side, there's also the calling for females. So alligators are most renowned for it, but they do these bellowing sessions in the morning where males from across the region will start making these loud bellows that have a subsonic frequency to them, that or infrasonic frequency to them that travels really well underwater. So that's where you see like the water dance above their backs when they're making their bellowing sounds.
The ripples, yes.
But they'll do that in the morning usually to assert who's in charge of where, and also to encourage females to come by to visit. In crocodile lids, like Nile crocodiles, there tends to be more of a head slapping behavior where they'll slap their jaws onto the water and then they blow bubbles underwater, and that apparently is very attractive to the females. Gerials are in some ways the most interesting because they have anatomical structures in their head that as far as I can tell are only there for an acoustic reason, so to make some kind of sound. But we don't hear too many sounds coming from them, or at least it's not talked about as much. But they can make a popping sound inside their head without actually having to open their mouth. And then they can blow air through this unique structure on males called a gera, which kind of looks like a tumorous lump to us, but apparently is very showy, and in dominant males can be very large. It flips the airway on top, right?
So the tip of the snout.
Now the tip of the snout, yeah. So it kind of flips up on top of it, the airway flips on top of it, and then it, when they blow air through it, will actually create a buzzing sound. So between the buzzing and the jaw pops, it is another way that the males are able to attract the females.
And while we're on the subject of sounds, can we quickly also address the point about vocalization? Well, do crocodilians roar?
Oh, that old chestnut. Yes, I would say crocodilians do roar. Depending on your species, alligators bellow, but Nile crocodiles can definitely emit a roar type sound. And in the false Gerial, Tomistoma, there are videos of it as well making a roar-like sound. Roaring definitely seems to be helpful if you're an African crocodile and you spend part of your time stealing food away from lions.
Yep.
That seems to be where you hear that roaring happen a lot.
So it's a combination of roaring and hissing in this case would be a play tool.
Yes, but crocodilians have a larynx that has vocal cords in it, so they are able to make different sounds, and that varies across their ontogeny. So young crocodilians emit chirping sounds.
Yep.
That they use
the laser shooting. Yes.
Yes, that they use to interact with each other as little babies, and also to contact their mom and nearby crocodiles if they get in trouble.
So if you come across a wild group of crocodilian hatchlings, for whatever reason, if they're not tended to by an adult, and you hear them chirping, while you're admiring their cuteness, their mother might be coming back and charging, potentially, basically taking you down because you are, well, disturbing the peace of the nest. So.
Yep. Yeah. You gotta be careful around nests, because females will get very, very defensive over their nests and their charges. Some crocodilians, some species. I'm trying to think of the species. I don't think Nile crocodiles do it. Maybe muggers. But in some species, you'll have both male and female taking care of the young. In some caiman, you will have one female taking care of the young for several females. So she's just the one that decided to be in charge.
So they can sort of take, just decide, hey, I'm gonna just basically, I got this, basically you go and eat or something.
It's kind of weird. It's like they let their young hatch and they go into this little like nursery pond and there's just one female there and she I guess doesn't want to share space with the other females or the other females are happy to have her take control.
Cayman daycare.
Cayman daycare. And then for Gerials, that this is where we see it the most often. It's the males that seem to be the ones that are largely guarding the young. So the young will hang out by large males.
That's very interesting. That is actually very surprising to me as well, because I was always under the impression that males in the reptiles, especially in crocodilians, they once they're past the courting and mating stages when it comes to these area things and intercourse, after it's done with that, he will just basically resume to his normal activities and just completely neglect it. But the whole caring and nurturing, nursing, whatever process. But you're saying that alligators, Gerials, males do actually engage in this process.
Yes, yes, they are caring fathers.
Nice. Props to that. So, Gerial father, crocodilian father of the year, I guess.
It's funny you say that because there is an image that goes around a lot that basically calls them that.
Oh, that's nice. I swear I had no idea, by the way. That was absolutely me just improvising on it and hoping that it would somehow land. But let's actually bring up an image you just sent me and I will save it.
So there's an image of a male Gerial watching over a creche of babies.
Let's have a look
that
at
one
this.
Be associated with Father of the Year.
Let's bring this up just a second, please. Okay, so the image is up. You guys should be able to see it as well. Just as you should be able to see that very prominent bump on a snout that Jason has just explained to us.
Yeah, it's hard to see it from that view, but everything that's above the water and that looks like a nostril is really just this weird bulbous structure sitting on top of the nostrils.
And then, of course, not to mention the amount of little babies that are just basically there, crowded.
So many babies there.
There's a lot of babies there. But the interesting question would be, now that we got to this point and we have identified that there's a lot of them, how many of them, if you can find any way to quantify it, would you expect to be able to make it at least to the point where they are relatively safe from being, predated on by something else, like maybe a potential mugger crocodile might want to have a bite, or maybe some wild cat or other kind of animal that might want to get its hands on it, maybe a lizard, maybe something else, a snake.
Yeah, or shorebirds. A lot of storks and stuff.
Or birds, yes.
Crocodilians. The mortality rate, even with parental care, is really low in crocodilians, is really high in crocodilians. So yeah, you're probably looking at maybe 5% of them making it to adulthood, and possibly less than that. The higher the number of eggs laid, the more likely that most of those are not going to make it to adulthood.
So in other words,
even though they are taking good care of them as best they can, I think part of it is like, well, I have 80 kids to keep track of. I'm going to lose track of a couple of them.
Yeah, that's probably the idea here. And who would you say, which of the animals do you think would be the most common sources of predation to the baby crocodilians?
That's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, it's when you are the size of a baby crocodilian, you are food for so many animals. You are so low on the food chain that hungry fish could eat you. Turtles would go for you. Again, a bunch of shorebirds are happy to go after you. And then as you get a little larger, then you become more prey for less fish and birds, but then you got to worry about big cats or other crocodilians. And then, of course, once you get into your teenage years and you want to start vying for territory, then the risk of death is there as well because you're getting into big fights all the time.
So that means that other crocodilians of your species who are bigger and more experienced than yourself are gonna be a big threat to you at that stage as well.
Yeah, and then there is cannibalism in crocodilians. So it's there if there's a hungry animal that's coming by and it's not related to you, it's always a chance that it could not so much mistake you for food, but decide that I'd rather eat you than protect you. So sometimes that occurs as well.
Oof.
So they have a high mortality rate.
It's basically not a very fun life to live as a crocodilian, if you will. If I were to make it so bluntly, I guess.
You can get to adulthood.
If you get to adulthood, then you
a lot
might be
better.
okay.
But
Yeah.
it's the odds are against you to reach adulthood. Which, one of the conservation efforts for crocodilians is to actually encourage hunting of young, small animals, because those are animals that are probably never, that are statistically unlikely to make it to adulthood anyway. But the larger adults are more off limits because they have already made it to adulthood. They're the ones that are going to be siring the next generation.
Which means that obviously, if they are already highly likely to be taken down by something else, the population is not really suffering a major blow, right? To the ecosystem.
So if you aim for the younger animals, as almost counterintuitive as it sounds, you are doing less damage to the population if you take a young animal than if you take a older, more established animal.
And of course, I mean, not that we necessarily have to delve too deep into it, but in this case, how does that affect other animals that hunt these baby crocodilians? If you are potentially stealing their food. Which, by the way, would you be, or would you actually still be having plenty to share as it is anyway?
You would be one other competitor, and as long as it's not like an industrial level of hunting, then you shouldn't really be affecting the food sources for other animals that much. Especially when it comes to eating young thing, like when it comes to eating babies, this is going to be taken out of context.
Yeah. Sorry, you too.
When it comes to eating babies, you can't really rely on it year round. It's much more of a seasonal thing.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Any animal that is relying on it for food is really using it more like garnishment, not a garnish, but like
opportunistic.
This is a nice.
As well.
Yeah, this is a nice opportunity. I'll gladly jump on this right now, but I'm not going to rely on this for my life.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, so I've got these animals are reproducing right now, so this is a perfect opportunity to get some extra vitamin boost that is gonna cost me relatively less in terms of exposing myself to the dangers of hunting versus what I would do otherwise when I do it normally on a daily basis throughout the year.
Yes.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up in this case, as we mentioned, obviously them growing up and everything, how long do you know, if you know of course, and whether or not it's different from species to species as well, groups to groups, etc. How long does it take for the crocodilians to reach their adult size? Not necessarily, obviously, maturity on any other aspects, but let's say how long does it take for them to reach the size of what you would expect to be an average typical adult?
I'd say a lot of species you're probably looking at around 15 to 20 years to reach what would basically be their maximum adult size. There'd still be growth beyond that, but the growth becomes so minuscule that the next like 10, 15 years they might have added like a couple of centimeters in length. So it's basically negligible.
So they technically never stop growing, but at a certain point you are not going to be able to notice any differences unless you keep track of the measurements all the time.
Yeah, well, so we thought for a long time that crocodilians had what's called indeterminate growth, where they just, like you say, grow throughout the rest of their lives. More recent work, especially extensive work by Dr. Holly Woodward, looking at just the femora of just so very many alligators, has found that they do reach a level of skeletal maturity that you could consider to be determinate growth, so that they eventually do reach a point where they stop growing. It is later in their lives than people have looked at before, so I think it's just easily missed. So it was assumed that they just kept always growing.
Hmm.
And this might be true for other reptiles as well that have been associated with indeterminate growth. So turtles, and then I think monitor lizards are considered that as well, and some snakes. That it's just that it's less so much that they grow forever as so much as that their end of growth just has a really long tail. So it takes many more years for them to just officially stop growing, even though the amount of growth they've been putting on through like maybe that last 15 years is almost nothing.
Right. And before we...
Thing.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no. Yeah, we're good.
Okay, we're good. Okay, lovely. I wanted to quickly go back to the hatchlings and get into the point of, how do they lay and incubate their eggs, and also starting from obviously how many can we expect to be laid per litter.
That will depend on the species. The big numbers of like 30 and 30 eggs per female, or up to 80 eggs for a lot of the larger species. So like Nile crocodiles can lay up to 80 eggs or so. Incubation is about what is it? Say it's about 3 months. Either in rotting vegetation, which is what we see alligators do, or in holes in the ground that the females dig, which is what a lot of crocodilian or crocodilids will do. So like Nile crocodiles will dig holes and deposit their eggs in the holes.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's that incubation time, and then there's the post-hatching time where the females take care of them afterwards. And that can range from a couple of weeks to a couple of years, depending on the species. Probably the most interesting one that comes to mind is the dwarf caiman, Paleozookas. Instead of laying their eggs in mounds of rotting vegetation, they seek out termite mounds, and they crack a hole in the mounds and lay their eggs there, and just let the heat from the termite mound incubate their eggs.
Does this potentially expose the hatchlings to the danger of being, well, eaten by the termites, or the termites just wouldn't care about something like that, even if the egg, say, cracks or something like that?
So the termites are probably none too happy about the female breaking in the first place to
I
lay
was
her
going to
eggs.
say, yeah, they would not be very happy if somebody just broke their house and decided to lay massive, like, clutch of eggs in there.
But aside from that, like once they close it up, the eggs are pretty safe because termites are vegetarian or herbivores,
That's
so
right.
they won't really go after the eggs. They don't kick the eggs out either, which you think would be a thing, but I guess the eggs are unobtrusive enough that they let them just sit there.
And that's very interesting. Well, sorry termites, you're going to be getting a rough end of the stick on this one.
At least they're not being eaten away like when they get found out by ants.
That's actually true.
That's largely covered sort of our rundown of crocodilians as a whole. Obviously,
I wanted to add one more thing, by the way, if you could, of course, comment on this.
Yeah.
I wanted to discuss, well, for you to explain and unpack how do they do when it comes to their vision. So their visionary capabilities in terms of sight, how do they... Do we know how they see things? Do we know how well can they see and how far can they see? And what is the idea, basically, of the vision and sight in the crocodilians?
Sure. So one thing worth mentioning is crocodilians across the board were considered cathemeral animals, so they're active basically throughout the day. So daylight, at night, they sleep on and off throughout the day, but they're active pretty much all 24 hours. So some are more active at night than others, but and there is a large component of their nocturnality that is probably pretty important, because compared to lizards and birds, crocodiles don't have as wide a range of vision. So they still see in color, and they can still see really well in color, but they don't see as many colors as a bird or a lizard would. But they'd see like as many colors as we do.
Wait, so they would see as many colors as humans would, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
that means
so we
that
have
did you just say that basically still less than birds and lizards, meaning
Yeah.
that
So
birds and lizards see more colors than we do.
yes, yeah. I think we mentioned it in the last episode.
It could be because it's been so long ago as well. But if it has
But
been
yeah, so
mentioned, then that's another
yes,
point
yeah,
to add.
birds and lizards, and I think turtles might have it as well. But definitely with birds and lizards, they can see into the near UV spectrum, so they can see some ultraviolet light, and they take advantage of oil droplets in their eyes that let them really distinguish between different hues of light.
Oh wow!
So the droplet spit is not seen in crocodilians, and the UV range, I don't think is something that crocodilians see in either. I think they're more trichromatic. So there's tetrachromatic, or 4 different types of photoreceptors that you see in a lot of reptiles, so lizards, birds, especially. But I don't think you get the tetrachromatic in crocodiles. I think those are just tri, which is what we have, where we see various colors. So it would be more in line with that. Crocodiles are better at seeing things in the dark. So they have a reflective layer of cells that is behind their retina that lets them reflect light back, which is why they have eye shine at night when you shine a light on them.
Yep.
So that's called the tapetum lucidum, or the light tapestry.
There's another interesting thing about their eyes before I forget. It's how they protect them. Their eyelids, how they close.
Yeah, so they have a structure that is actually pretty common to most animals. Mammals, or not mammals, but primates lose it. But they have a third eyelid, so that nictitating membrane, which is like a clear eyelid that passes over. It acts like goggles, so they can see underwater. They can't see particularly well underwater because covering up your eye with a goggle only works so well because there's a lot of different light refraction that happens underwater that it just helps to have a different shaped eye to make it work. But they can still see some stuff underwater. But yeah, they have that. They also have the ability to pull their entire eyeball into their skull. So there's a muscle called the retractor bulbi that actually pulls the whole thing into the skull. So they can really heavily protect their eye if they need to.
That is one thing I never actually knew they were able to do. I've never seen. So what would be something that you expect to trigger this ability? Would that be, I was talking almost like a gamer here, but would that be them potentially fighting so that they don't get bit in the eye, basically, and so it doesn't get poked out by like a stray tooth that gets shoved in it from another member of its species? Or could it be something else?
I think anything that gets close to the eye and could potentially cause damage will cause them to retract their eye in. It probably happens a lot when they initially launch an attack on a prey item.
Yeah, resisting prey, perhaps.
And yeah, if there's an animal, if they're in a fight with another animal and their snout gets a little too close to their eye, I imagine they'd probably pull their eyes in then too. Downside is if you get attacked by an alligator, it might be a little harder. Well, if you get attacked by an alligator, it's unlikely. But if you get attacked by a crocodile, it's going to be harder to like try to poke at their eyes.
Oh my god, yeah.
Assuming you're thinking straight enough to do that.
That is one thing, and secondly, even if you are and you're able to, then you have a lower chance to strike that sort of, potentially vulnerable spot to cause them to distract the attention from you onto their, other area, so that they could let you go or loosen the grip. So, speaking of, how would you get? Well, I mean, I don't think we can really say it enough, I suppose, that we do not want anybody to end up in jaws of a crocodilian for whatever reason.
It would not be a good day for anybody.
It would not be a good day for anybody, and in an extremely bad case, which can be a very big possibility, it would be a terrible day for the other family members as well, from yourself. That basically meaning that, you're very likely to be killed. But to say something about that, how would you normally go about, getting yourself free if, like you say, you have a crocodilian? Let's say even if it's a smaller crocodilian that managed to grip a limb and you're trying to let it go. Let's say if it's a cougar drawer came in that is just literally like it grabbed onto your arm, for example, and is not letting go and clamping down on it. So how would you try to make it loosen it? What are normally things that you would expect to be doing, if you know, of course?
That one's a tough one. I'm not sure. Finding a way to pry their jaws open would definitely come in handy. Keeping them from twisting is important.
Mhm.
So it's, we didn't talk too much about, but because crocodiles don't chew, if they can't bite something off in one bite, then they have to either pull really hard with their necks to rip the thing loose, or they'll do what is more affectionately called the death roll, where they'll spin their body like a top and with their jaws closed and just twist off the food item that they're eating. An
This is
interesting thing about that is
mm,
that death rolling induces a lot of torque on the skull, so it wants to twist the skull. And a means of avoiding that twisting torque on the skull is to create a large shelf of bone in the palate. So
right.
that's why crocodiles, it's hypothesized, that is why crocodiles evolved a secondary palate that's bony. So that's the area, and the roof of the mouth basically separates your nasal airways from your oral airways. So humans have a secondary palate, but our secondary palate's all made out of soft tissue. So if you stick your tongue all the way to the back of your mouth and pull up, you can actually feel the difference where you go from bone covering the roof of your mouth to just tissue.
That's right. Yeah.
In crocodiles, you can't do that. It's bone all the way back.
Hmm.
And the hypothesis is that it has something to do, it has more to do. Originally, the hypothesis was that it's just there so they can breathe and eat at the same time. That's probably not that big of an issue. It's more likely it's there to reduce the stress on the skull, in particular the stress of them spinning like that. Now, that means that if we look back in the fossil history of crocodiles, we can actually see where that secondary palate developed. So we can look back and see outside of Eusuchia, the true crocodiles, you don't get a secondary palate made out of just bone,
Okay.
which theoretically means that once you get outside of Eusuchia, those animals might not be able to do a death roll. So they might not have used death roll techniques as a means to pop large chunks of meat off of their prey. So if we take this to some of the more famous fossil crocs like Sarcosuchus, that is an animal. It's called a phyllitosaur. It is way outside of Eusuchia, so they're not really all that closely related to our modern crocs. They don't have a secondary palate, which might mean that an animal like Sarcosuchus wasn't doing a lot of death rolling. Possibly.
And
It's interesting.
also, contrary to what many people might believe, that even though it does appear that it has a narrow snout, it's still actually considerably wider than your average gharial, if you will, and even the prehistoric extinct gharials as well. So it's
Yeah.
kind of still, in terms of the robustness, it's still there, in a sense of, like, kind of
If we go
closer to
over
crocodile.
if we go over fossil or extinct animals in future episodes, we could definitely go into
I was
like
gonna say, yeah, we
just
should
how
try.
very different
Yeah.
Sarcosuchus is compared to all of its contemporaries. It is an animal that evolved from animals with thin snouts and is doing its best to be a thick-snouted boy.
Yeah, I was gonna say something like that because the other members of the same family, that they do not look like they're as robust in a snout as the Sarcosuchus. And that's a good point. It means that the death rolls were off the table, probably, if we are to assume that this hypothesis is correct, and that the idea of evolving this palette of bone is indeed related as an evolutionary mechanism to support that model of feeding. So you
Yep.
could be
So it's
right.
using modern-day animals and what our knowledge of their anatomy and biomechanics are to inform us about extinct animals and potential behavior repertoires or limits on their behavior.
At least by deduction, in some way, shape, or form, is possible. Obviously, not to the degree we would dream or hope, because we cannot
Of
go
course.
back in time or resurrect them to witness it directly. But the closest we can get to that is by looking at, as you said, what we have here and just deducing to see if features that would indicate this behavior are present in other animals that were extinct, and also if whether or not there are animals that we know from today who could deploy this kind of method while they don't have these features present, and we do not see, I believe, this kind of behavior in animals that lack this type of feature.
Right. There's much more of a whipping the head back and forth. That seems to be the main method of splitting splitting pieces off of things that animals without this bony secondary palate and that don't chew seem to use to like break stuff loose.
Just like you will see that in the water, like they can use. I think they also use their bodies to propel themselves as well to assist the movement. And when it comes to the ground, if we talk about obviously briefly other animals, they would just like cats or for example or wolves, dogs, etc. They would basically once they grip, they would try to wave their body a little bit, and also they would try to find a solid sort of way to tuck themselves in so that they don't slide as well, so they can pull and use the ground as means to kind of fixate their position to make it to reinforce it a bit more. So they would kind of go backwards the opposite direction mostly to try to pull things out rather than try to do it the way the crocs do, like they spin, and that way they basically rip the chunks of flesh out. So that's just something that I've noticed that happens quite a lot. And speaking of the death row, I wanted to bring up a case in case you haven't known, and I know for a fact that me and Jason have seen it because we discussed this occurrence in private. The unfortunate incident that, if you remember, occurred with a worker who was probably trying to either tending to an alligator, or she was either whatever she was doing with it. I don't remember what it was, but the alligator somehow managed to grab her and pulled her into the water. But then what she did, instead of allowing the gator to freely do the roll, she actually gripped herself around the gator so that their movements would not go the opposite direction, but they would be in sync together, thus not allowing the gator to do what it was intending to do, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, that was the pet shop owner. I can't remember, but her name. But yeah, it was down in Florida. And yeah, she played it smart. Like you roll with the crocodile, so that, or in this case, the alligator, so that it can't do the damage that the death roll is intended to do.
And for obvious reasons, so to avoid graphic content, I would not be showing this video here. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about that is that this is something, this is probably going to be the last thing before we segue into birds, and I think this will nail the crocodilians in general. How much of the energy in terms of how they they expand when they do their launch, when they charge towards their prey, because what I have noticed, at least from that clip that we've seen from this poor girl getting attacked and pulled in by that gator, was that she had to basically simply stay there long enough in sync with this gator for it to run out of stamina, probably, before it starts catching its breath and potentially trying to recover its energy before it can try again. And that's when I think someone else jumped in to basically release the lock of the jaws so that she could escape before the gator could come back and try to resume its process. So would you be able to comment anything on that in terms of how does that work, in terms of how their energy works when they initially charge, and how long would they normally be needing to recover before they can do the attack again, before they are reset, if you will?
Yeah, there's a lot of it to talk about how the endurance in crocodilians. In general, yeah, they because they're semi-aquatic and most of what their actions are doing is underwater, having a high, what you call aerobic scope, or the ability to really just take in and use a lot of oxygen, probably isn't all that useful for them in the first place, since most of their time is spent away from the ability to breathe. So crocodiles do have a very high anaerobic scope, so they can do a lot of stuff with their breath held, or a lot of stuff that doesn't, not so much not require oxygen, but that can rely on other methods to feed the muscles. Now, the downside to that is that even a high anaerobic scope can only go so far because it's just hard to do a lot of energy intensive stuff without getting oxygen to the system. So because of that, crocodiles do tend to tire pretty quickly. You usually, if a crocodile launches after you, and if it misses the first time, it might try a second time, but it's going to be half-hearted, and that's the extent of it. Right? They're not going to chase you down. The one exception to that, it seems to be Cuban crocodiles that are willing to chase you around for a bit. They tend to be more aerobically active than a lot of other crocodilians.
And may I also point out that Cuban crocs also have a pretty nasty, well, set of teeth to go with it as well, coincidentally.
That they do. They are also quick learners and seem to be very happy to learn new things, but they have scary faces, so it just looks like they want to kill you all the time.
And while we're at it, I want to quickly find a good image of a Cuban crocodile, so that we get to look at this beauty, because Cuban crocodile actually is probably, I mean, of course there are contenders, but
they're very photogenic.
Yeah, and they look kind of cool as well, to be honest. They really do.
They do. They have parietal bumps on them, so on the back of their skull by their ears, that are almost like little horns.
Yes.
But yeah, so crocodiles use a lot of anaerobic energy to capture their prey, which I think gets overplayed a little bit, especially in the paleo circles, about how crocodiles are like lazy and they don't have the energy to really keep going. But it's really more that they have evolved in a direction of explosive power, and as anyone who has done any kind of work in the gym with strength training or anything where you're lifting weights, they're already aware, but explosive power comes from muscles that have a lot of muscle fibers in them, but don't have a lot of access to oxygen. So it's a lot of what you call the white muscle in chicken, or this fast glycolytic muscle, what is known as.
Right.
So that's what generates power in animals, invertebrates. So all of us, we generate power the same way, using really thick muscle that is good to go really fast, but tires out very quickly. The muscle that's good for long distance running is really deeply infused with oxygen, but it has fewer muscle fibers, and so it can go for a long time, but it can't generate nearly as much force, especially not in a short amount of time. And if you're going to be an ambush hunter and you're hunting something on the edge of the water, and that animal is about the size of you, you're going to want to generate a lot of power, which means you're going to be putting all that power into muscles that at the end of the day are never going to have access to enough oxygen anyway. So you might as well just build them up and just increase your tolerance to having low oxygen in the system for a long time.
So it's basically investing all this energy into this first charge, which is gonna be your pretty much decisive factor whether or not you get to eat that same time or not.
Yeah, so the crocs will launch themselves, get the prey at them, and then use the rest of that energy to drag them into the water and just drown them. They can hold a strong grip on their prey for an exceedingly long period of time. So you can go for an hour or two. There are videos of like crocodiles and wildebeests going at it for like an hour or two, and most of that time is spent with both animals looking exhausted in the water. But the croc's not letting go.
Yeah,
It's when the croc tries to go for a new bite that it usually winds up losing the animal.
Yeah,
but
it tries to
have their
lets
initial
go,
bite,
and then because the moment it lets go, that's when the animal's gonna quickly jump out and run. And this could also be very interesting. It's one of the things I noticed, that when they initially grab, it's not the bite alone on its own, I think, that does the main damage to the animal. So once it bites and holds it, that itself is not what does the damage. I think the most damage is done once they get into the water and start death rolling. That's, I think, where the true damage is being done, where it's beyond, any possibility for that animal to recover from.
It will depend on where they bite.
And where they bite,
a lot
of course,
times, a lot of times they wind up biting on like the haunches or the legs, and if it's a good bite, then that'll shatter the animal's head.
That leg is gone. Yeah.
But yeah, they have they have to drown the animal to actually have a chance to do anything with it. So unless the animal's completely paralyzed or something, usually they spend a lot of time trying to get them underwater and hold them down until they stop struggling.
That's very interesting.
And then with like Nile crocodiles and mugger crocodiles, there's also group tactics that'll come into play. So one crocodile will help another one that it sees working with a big prey item, and they'll help to drown it. So there's a degree of cooperative hunting that does take place and is known to take place in crocs. It wouldn't qualify as pack hunting in that they don't seem to be like herding one animal towards another, but
it's like they temporarily they gang up and they, for the common cause at the moment, to take down the prey item, and then once the prey is available, the biggest one is probably gonna be pushing to take a first bite and just not letting anyone else to interfere until it has its own fill of the juicy parts, I would imagine.
It again depends.
It depends as well, yeah.
They seem to be pretty tolerant of each other, and the prey they take are usually large enough that there's enough to go around.
So it's not
saltwater
needs to fight,
crocodiles don't usually work together as groups, and they tend to get into a lot more fights with each other. So they're much more territorial.
Salties.
Yep. Salties get a little salty.
Yeah, and that's where the aggression's coming from, I suppose, where they are considered. That's because I mean, even Harry, I believe, when we were doing a stream, sometime we were, or just like a video recording or something, he mentioned that salties can be pretty darn like nasty in terms of their temper.
Oh, definitely.
And one other thing I wanted to probably say is, first of all, I wanted to send you this image because you don't have it, so I cannot really comment on it, but that's in reference to our conversation prior about the Cuban crocodile. So there's that nice shot of it, and we can see very interesting how the bottom teeth at the front are both sticking out and getting over the snout, over the tip of the snout as well, which I don't know why, but for some reason it just makes it look a little bit funny when you start looking at it long enough. So I don't know if you're getting the same impression or not. So post your comments below if you think that it's interesting the way that came out. I personally find it very interesting.
They do look really cute that way. Yeah, a lot of crocodiles, those two teeth will be covered by the upper jaw, and as the animals get older, those two teeth will actually punch through the upper jaw and make new holes.
Yeah, that was another thing I wanted to ask. So it's something that I noticed seems to happen quite a lot, does it? Like
it does. We don't know why. It looks like it must be hella painful, but
must be.
But it's just there's enough push there, and it eventually just digs a hole right through the skull.
And obviously you can see in this picture the side teeth there that go from the top jaw. Pretty big teeth, and almost they almost remind you because of the curvature as well, because they do have a bit of a curvature to their teeth as well, these Cuban crocs. That's another thing I wanted to point out, that I don't see quite as much, or maybe I just haven't looked long enough, but I haven't noticed this type of curvature on other crocodiles and crocodilians in general, at least from the modern day ones, as I did in the Cuban croc. And I look at it from the side sometimes and I'm like, that reminds me of a certain Tyrannosaurus-ish animals, if you will, distinctively, like very distantly, but somewhat brings up certain associations.
Oh yeah.
So what I wanted to do now that we have pretty much, I believe, have we exhausted all the topics regarding their...
I think we've covered it all. Yeah, there's just the extinct fellas, and that could be a future... That's most likely to be a future video anyway. But yeah. So that's... So
what I wanted to do... I wanted to break this one right here because I wanted to obviously prepare the next segment for the birds, and obviously break it at 2.5 hours so that it will be basically just 2 videos, and I think maybe for the viewers it will be a bit easier as well to split it into these topics, since our Crocodilian segment ended up being 2.5 hours. So
It's so Archosaurs Part 1.
yeah, so that's Archosaurs Part 1, and then I suppose, guys, we shall see you in Archosaurs Part 2 very shortly, because it's gonna get recorded probably in the same session, if Jason is not too tired yet. Jason, how do you think you're gonna be able to go for birds, or later? How do you want to do it? Your choice.
Yeah. Boy, yeah. There's.
All right, let's discuss it off the record, actually, if you don't mind. So let's.
Yeah, we have to figure out how to make it fit. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. So, anyways, let's. For now, we'll just say thanks for watching, and if you're new, please subscribe and catch up with the older content as well. Whatever you find interesting, feel free and help yourself. And welcome to the channel. And hopefully, we get to talk a little bit, if you know, either in the comment section, or if you would like to join my server. Then let me know as well, and we can discuss, further options. Anyways, thanks for watching, and you guys take care, and thanks Jay for coming on, and we will be back with you guys hopefully shortly.
Absolutely.
All right.